We're here to bring a new type of news show.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Bringing news just for you. It's Thursday, July 17th here in Seoul. I'm Lee Soo-jin, and this is News Generation. Joining us today is Park Yoon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. And Brooke Prince is also with us.
Hello, happy to be here.
Good to have you. And both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. So it's Thursday, which means we're going to begin with our keyword news, where we look at a story that has been gaining traction over the past 24 hours. And today's keyword is family planning. The South Korean women report the lowest willingness to have children among the 8 major UN member states that were surveyed. According to a report by the Korean Women's Development Institute, South Korean women scored the lowest in childbearing intention with a rating of 1.58 out of 5. South Korean men scored higher with 2.09, the widest gap between genders, highlighting the difference between men and women in attitudes towards having children. So today we have panelists of opposite genders, which makes it a great opportunity to hear different perspectives on this topic, especially when it comes to how men and women view having children. So Kyun, have your own views on parenthood changed over time? Why or why not?
Yes, it actually has, and I would just like to mention that men seem to be, I guess, a little luckier, not having to go through 9 months of pregnancy, plus giving birth. I've heard from friends' wives how painful it can get, and I fully respect all the mothers who gave birth to their child, including my mom, for all their commitment and endurance.
Yes.
In saying that, in my 20s, when I came back to Korea from Australia, that is, I really didn't want to start my own family because I thought, wow, this is too much for me. Just reality really hit me. It was overwhelming, but once I hit my 30s, seeing more friends get married and having kids. A close friend of mine recently had his second child, and she looked beautiful. So I thought, hey, maybe I could start my own family. But at the end of the day, it all really comes down to my future wife. She's the one who's going to give birth to my child, so it really depends on her and for me to kind of maybe convince her. And yeah, so I'm just going to leave it to my wife.
I think what you said in the beginning and the end about how it's your wife's choice is a great answer.
Wow, very wise words. Yes.
What about you, Brooke? What are your thoughts?
I would agree. There's something about hitting your 30s where suddenly it's like a pressure cooker, especially as a woman. I feel like there is sort of that stigma where once you get into your 30s, you need to settle down and start having children. And I do want that for myself someday. I remember I used to say someday when I was younger, and it just feels like it's still far away, even though I'm getting older. But it's funny, the conversations with my family, they used to be something like, oh, Brooke, are you dating? Have you met anyone? And now it's like, have you thought about freezing your eggs? Have you thought about adoption? Right? The conversation sort of shifts as you get older as a woman because there's that so-called biological clock, and it feels like this sort of ticking countdown. But I don't ever want to have a child just because I feel like I need to, especially with how frightening the world can be, as we're going to talk about later in the show. I think if you're going to bring a human life into this world, you really need to feel sure about it and settled in that decision. So I'm just kind of waiting for that moment.
I think, like you said, it's really hard to know because it's such a big decision. It's hard to know when to make this decision, if it's the right decision for me. So there's a lot to think about. And it's also clear that when it comes to starting a family, men and women face different realities. But opening up these kinds of conversations might just be the first step into closing that gap and building a future where the choice to have children feels more supported for everyone. And that concludes our keyword news for this Thursday. And as we head into the final stretch of the work week, we're diving into a topic that affects personal safety, sparks generational debate, and continues to challenge society. So let's take a look at the screen to learn more. Stalking and dating violence cases are often in the news in South Korea. But a lack of recognition about the seriousness of these crimes still lingers, as courts often deny arrest warrants, even when requested by police, citing factors like the suspect's lack of previous convictions. In June, police requested an arrest warrant for a 48-year-old man accused of stalking and threatening a woman in her 50s after she refused to meet him. However, the court denied the arrest warrant. Not long after, the man allegedly broke into her apartment and killed her. The case sparked national outrage and renewed calls for stronger legal protections for stalking victims. As we just saw in the video, stalking isn't always as dramatic or obvious as it's portrayed in films or on TV. In reality, it can take many different forms, some subtle, some deeply invasive, and it often builds over time. Kyung, to start with the basics, what exactly is stalking? What kinds of behaviors fall under that term?
So stalking is defined as an act that causes anxiety or fear to another person against their will and without justifiable reason. Specifically, behaviors that fall under stalking include approaching the victim or their residence without consent, watching, monitoring, or following the victim, sending messages or other forms of communications to the victim, delivering unwanted items to the victim, and damaging or tampering with the victim's belongings. So when these actions are carried out persistently or repeatedly, they are considered a stalking crime.
So if you look at these actions like individually, it doesn't seem very serious, but if it happens like repeatedly and if the person who is receiving these unwanted items and attention, it can still be considered stalking.
Right.
So Brooke, what are some key high-profile stalking or dating violence cases in Korea?
You know, when people ask me about why I like living in Korea, I would say safety is always at the top of the list. Prior to living here, I lived in LA and I experienced many robberies and other incidents, so I really always sing the praises of Korea as a generally safer country than others. But I do think that there is a misconception that there is no crime here. It's some sort of utopia, but that does not exist. Bad things still happen here, as we saw in the very shocking video earlier. And during my research for this show, I definitely discovered many unsettling and disturbing cases, such as one where a man in his 70s actually stalked a woman where she was working, and she was running the shop by herself, which is a very vulnerable position to be in. But what was the most alarming thing about this case is the fact that 2 years prior, he'd actually threatened her with a knife. And he was given a suspended sentence, which means that he did not go to jail, and he was allowed to harass and continue stalking her after that. Now, fortunately, no physical harm came to her, but it's very easy for these stalking cases to escalate to that point. We saw that with the Shindang Station murder, in which a woman was stabbed to death after being stalked by a man, and it happened just one day before he was set to be sentenced for stalking her. And so I think what these cases really highlight is the fact that the legal protections at this point are not enough to protect victims. And it also shows that stalking is not a harmless behavior. It's something that is a very dangerous threat that can have tragic consequences.
That's a good reminder that it's important to make sure to not, when the victims speak out, to make sure they're not brushed off as someone who's being too dramatic. Like with the Shindang Station murder case, like you said, she had already reported the man for stalking.
Yep.
And if it was taken seriously, maybe that could have been prevented. So that's a really important point. So Kyun, how are stalking crimes currently punished under South Korean law?
So in South Korea, the Act on the Punishment of Stalking Crimes has been in effect since 2021. However, there are doubts about how effectively it is being enforced. Although reports of stalking continue to rise, the rate of suspects being formally detained, that is, being arrested or held in custody, has sharply declined. In 2021, the detention rate was 7%. In 2022, it dropped to 3.3%. And in 2023, it fell further to 3.2%, more than a 50% decrease compared to 2021. So this low level of detention is seen as problematic because stalking is a crime that involves continuous threat to victims, yet substantial punitive measures such as arrest remain very limited. And we have to keep in mind that stalking can lead to violence, and violence can lead to eventually murder. So, as we have seen with the videos and many cases that we talked about, so I think a bit more serious it needs to be looked into a bit more seriously.
Right, and the figures that you talked about highlights the difference between the disconnect between the law on paper and how it's actually being practiced. And looking at different countries, so what do stalking laws look like in countries like the United States, Brooke?
Well, back in the US, I used to work as a legal assistant for a criminal law firm, so I saw many awful cases. I saw the way they were handled and how they were punished. And I will say I do think America has generally harsher punishments than Korea, certainly, and other countries as well. Looking at the history of stalking in particular. It was criminalized 30 years ago in 1994 with the landmark Violence Against Women Act. And this case, it was the first legal framework that actually recognized stalking as a form of violence. And stalking in the U.S. is now prosecuted mostly on a state-by-state basis, but there are also federal laws that have to do with stalking. It can escalate to federal stalking if you use the mail, if it crosses state lines, and also if you utilize cyber stalking. I definitely want to mention that on today's show. In the modern age, with the technology that we have, stalking is not just something that happens in person. It can happen right on your devices that you carry with you every day. So if those categories are met, you can be convicted for federal stalking, which means there are fines of up to $250,000 and prison sentences of up to 5 years. There are harsher sentences if minors are involved or if there are weapons involved as well. Another thing I want to mention is that many states have what's called a mandatory arrest policy. And what that means is that regardless of whether the victim presses charges or not, police can intervene and protect them. They can remove the perpetrator from the premises, which is really key in domestic violence cases, especially. A lot of people think this stuff happens only between strangers, but a lot of the time it happens with someone you know, and victims are very afraid to speak out or press charges for fear of retaliation. So with the mandatory arrest policy, they can still be protected. So I do think the U.S. deserves some credit for the way that it handles certain crimes, and Korea could maybe look to enact some of those changes as well.
That sounds like a very comprehensive legal framework, and it also highlights, like you said, what's other legal systems in other countries like South Korea can do to kind of make different efforts on early prevention as well. So is it true that younger generations like Gen Zs are more sensitive to stalking than older generations, and why is this the case, Kyun?
Yes, it is true, and it can be backed by statistics. The surveys in South Korea suggest that younger generations, including Gen Zs, are more sensitive to stalking compared to the older generations. Let's take a look at the screen for more details. According to Korean Criminal Psychology Review, 47% of Gen Z respondents reported having experienced actual stalking. In comparison, only 25% of millennials and Gen X respondents reported such experiences, while just 3% of baby boomers said they had been stalked. Furthermore, when asked about priorities for regulating stalking crimes, Gen Z and millennials emphasize victim protection and punishing offenders as the most important measures. Meanwhile, baby boomers prioritize education on prevention and response over punitive measures.
That stark difference with baby boomers, only 3% of them reporting, makes me think like maybe there were cases that they didn't consider it stalking.
I think that's the case, yeah.
Yeah, rather than it was actually that less. Brooke, so how do different generations define and perceive stalking?
Well, I would say our generation, the younger generation, certainly focuses on personal boundaries a lot more. So we see these unwanted advances as what they are, which is a form of stalking. And I think that's because older generations, they might view these behaviors like repeatedly asking someone out on a date or sending them what are perceived as gifts. That's just being persistent. That's romantic, right? It's manly, it's chivalrous. We even saw this in old Hollywood films, which certainly haven't aged very well. There's a movie called There's Something About Mary, which I found, very funny as a kid. But if you watch it again now, you can see there are many, stalking references and storylines that are played for laughs. And I don't think that this generation, this day and age, would find it very funny. I think that stalking, they don't want it to be seen as not serious or a laughing matter. They want stronger and firmer boundaries and more protection for victims. So I think that's the difference. There's a change in attitude over time.
And it's not just old films, because Twilight, for example.
That's right.
Edward literally sneaks into her room and watches her while she's sleeping, which is technically classic stalker behavior.
It's quite toxic.
Right, but it's framed as romantic, which is quite problematic as well. So to learn more about how stalking is handled under South Korean law and why victims often struggle to get protection, we're going to speak to a legal expert from Korea to break down what the current laws say, why enforcement can be so difficult, and what changes might help keep people safer. And that conversation will come after the break, so don't go anywhere.
NewsGen wants to hear from you. Go to YouTube, and search our channel Arirang News. Click Community and leave a comment down below. Make a new type of news with us.
Joining us today is Kim Ji-soo, a lawyer from Korea. Hi, Ji-soo. Thank you so much for connecting with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So how is stalking punished under current South Korean law?
So in the past, stalking was treated as a minor offenses, which fines of less than 100,000 won. However, it was recognized as a potential warning sign of more serious crimes such as assault or even murder. So legal reforms were introduced, and as one of your panel has already mentioned, South Korea has enacted a called Stalking Punishment Act in 2021. And as a result, stalking is now punishable by up to 3 years in prison or a fine of up to 30 million won. And in 2023, the law was also amended to further strengthen the victim's protection. And one major change was the removal of the offense unpunishable over objection rule, which is also known as 반의사 불벌죄. And so this means that the authorities are able to proceed legal actions even if the victims explicitly don't want the offenders to be punished. So these all enactments enlightens a stronger government will to punish offenders that are related to stalking crimes.
Ji-soo, why is it often difficult to prosecute stalking cases, and what kind of evidence do victims need to provide?
So even though stalking reports have increased dramatically since the law was enacted in 2021, the rate of detention and prosecution remains still low. And one of the key reasons for this is that stalking cases are often very complex and difficult to prove. For instance, the law requires the behavior must be unjustified, repeated, or continuous, and it should also cause fear and anxiety to the victim. And these conditions should all simultaneously be met, and each involves a very subjective judgment, which sets a very high bar for prosecution. And under the burden of proof rule, the victims typically need to collect all the evidence and present a strong supporting material to prove the offender's guilt. So the evidence includes items such as text messages, call logs, CCTV footages, or witness statements. And these are really hard to get for the victims. And also because a single incident is not enough, these evidence must show a pattern of behavior which takes time and effort to document. And personally, in most of the cases I've dealt with, fear or anxiety is evaluated very subjectively based on the context. And the relationships between the individuals involved are very hard to objectively define. So I think that is the main reason why it's so difficult to establish clear legal grounds and proceed with prosecution.
Well, thank you so much for all of this information. Earlier, you mentioned that the fine used to be 100,000 won, which for any Americans watching, that's like $75. So it's crazy what it used to be. I'm glad that's changed. My question for you would be, what other kinds of changes, whether legal, social, or institutional, do you think are needed to more effectively prevent or eliminate stalking crimes?
So as I mentioned earlier, although the number of stalking reports has increased and legal punishments have become stricter, the reality has not caught up. So this is mainly due to the vague legal definitions, as I mentioned earlier, surrounding the requirements of stalking offenses. So first, I think we need to specifically specify the legal standards based on real-life cases to guide investigations in a more objective and consistent manner. And this will help them to reduce confusion and inconsistency. And at the same time, the victim protection must be strengthened. And although there are already existing emergency measures, there's manners such as banning the offender from coming within 100 meters. These are just administrative penalties, not criminal ones. So simply put, even if the offender violates these restrictions, they may only receive fines and no criminal record is left behind. So without stronger consequences, such measures may not effectively prevent offenders from repeating it. And lastly, stalking is often a very persistent and repeatable crime. So prevention and protection is in need to be proactive. And I think the government should invest more in early intervention and have better access to support services for victims, including maybe counseling and emergency relocation if it is necessary. So by combining legal clarity and social awareness and institutional support, I believe we can create a safer environment and more effectively reduce the risk of stalking-related harm.
You've shared a lot of important points with us, and for me, what really stood out was how you said, prosecution a lot of times is hard because emotions like fear can be quite subjective. So, right, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we just heard from a lawyer who spoke to us about how stalking is defined under South Korean law, why it can be difficult to punish offenders, and what kind of evidence victims need to provide. Now to wrap up our discussion for today, Kyun, what kinds of legal steps are currently being taken to tackle stalking crimes? And looking ahead, what policies or measures do you think could be more effective to prevent these crimes and better protect potential victims?
Honestly, I think Jisoo just laid out pretty much everything that we need to know about the South Korean law and things like that. So, but just my personal view is that raising public awareness and clarifying what defines stalking, because there are different forms, and victims, future victims, may not realize they're actually stalking and it's actually illegal. So having that clear outline of what actually stalking is and having those like bullet points, like that's very clear for everyone to kind of understand. And because like I said, a lot of people might be doing this without knowing, but once they do repeatedly and like over time, it can become a criminal offense. So I think just laying out the basic rules and knowing the public know what actually defines stalking could help.
And what are your thoughts on this, Brooke?
I would agree. I think we need to recognize the severity of stalking. Just because it hasn't yet escalated to a physical assault doesn't mean it won't. And even if it doesn't, it can still cause extreme psychological harm to a person. So I think we should prioritize the victim's peace of mind, perhaps with electronic ankle monitoring so that we can always keep track of these perpetrators and keep the victim safe. I think we need harsher punishments if there are minors or weapons involved. I would also say that we should make sure that the victim's personal information is not released during the trial so that we can keep those victims safe and hold perpetrators accountable.
So as stalking and dating violence continues to impact lives, it's clear that stronger protections and awareness are needed. But understanding the issue and helping raise awareness of the seriousness of this is the first step towards change. And if stalking is to be taken seriously, it has to be treated as the crime it is, not just by victims and law enforcement, but by society as a whole. We're also conducting a program survey that includes News Generation to better meet our viewers' expectations. So please visit us at www.arirang.com or on the Arirang TV mobile app to share your valuable feedback. By participating, you'll also have a chance to win Bluetooth earbuds and exclusive K-pop merchandise. So this brings us to the end of today's episode of News Generation, but News Gen will be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Korea time. A big thanks to Kyun.
Always a pleasure.
And Brooke.
Thank you for having me.
And to all our viewers, thanks so much for watching, and we hope you have the best day. We are News Generation.